So I was born and raised in China. While I was growing up, China was an isolated country. We didn't know anything about the outside world except what we were told. We were told that America was hell. American soldiers were devils. They're coward and cruel. This is the kind of image we grew up with. We call American soldiers 美国鬼子, which meant American devils. We were not told that Americans had participated in the war against Japan in China, and they made vital contributions in winning the war. I had never heard of the Flying Tigers before I came to this country. Never in my wildest dream could I imagine that one day I will end up in this part of the world and write a book about American heroes. 2 books, actually. The main character in both books is the same American pilot who bravely fought the Japanese in World War II in China. Most Americans think of World War II as beginning on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. By then, China had already fought the Japanese for 10 years. As early as 1931, Japan had launched an undeclared war on China. 6 years later, in July 1937, they started a full-scale invasion. Soon, Peking fell, Shanghai followed. Nanking, the capital of the Republic of China, became Japanese next target. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Japanese military officials boasted that they could conquer China, the entire country, in 3 months. They had a lot more advanced military. For example, at the time, they had 3,000 aircraft, where China only had 300. But it took them more than 3 months to conquer Shanghai, one city. And the Japanese suffered heavy losses during the fight in Shanghai. And that enraged the Japanese. They marched towards Nanking with anger and madness. Along the way, they followed a policy. It's called 3 O's policy: loot all, burn all, kill all. They turned villages into ghost villages, towns into ghost towns, even cities into ghost cities. Knowing the Japanese invasion, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist government, fled the city on December 9, 1937, shifting the burden of defense to a general. General Tan vowed to live or die with Nanking. His troops, 90,000 of them, transformed the streets of Nanking into battlefields. Nanking actually had its advantage for defense. A massive stone wall built hundreds of years ago in Ming Dynasty encircled the entire city. There are also natural barriers like the Yangtze River and tall mountains surrounding the city. However, several days into the fight, Chiang Kai-shek changed his mind. He wanted to save his troops, so he ordered to retreat. This created a chaos because by then the Japanese already surrounded the city, and the Chinese soldiers, with those tall city walls and the Yangtze River, the Chinese soldiers had no easy way to retreat. They were trapped inside the city. On December 13th, 1937, 4 days after Chiang Kai-shek left the city, Japanese captured Nanking. And immediately, the Japanese soldiers started an unspeakable massacre. In 6 weeks, they killed 300,000 Chinese and raped over 20,000 women from age 8 to age 80. Therefore, this event is also called the Rape of Nanking. The Japanese mowed down innocent people by machine guns, burned them alive, or buried them alive, or used them for practice. There were even killing contests. The next few slides just showed very few atrocities. There are hundreds of pictures just like those, taken mostly by Japanese soldiers at the time. And I wrote a scene based on this photo in my first book. Surrounded by beautiful mountains and the Yangtze River, rich in art and history, Nanking is a beautiful city. But the Japanese turned it into a hell on earth. For weeks, the streets were littered with dead bodies, and the air was reeked of smoke and rotten human flesh. On the verge of this massacre, Jasmine Bai, the main character of my book, a beautiful college student, returned to Nanking. She was too late to save her parents, but in time to witness the horrors. She survived the massacre thanks to a group of Westerners and mostly Americans. They formed the International Committee and established the International Safety Zone. Really, with nothing but courage and compassion, those foreigners tried their best to help the Chinese people. The safety zone accommodated and saved 300,000 refugees, half of the population of the city. The other half of the people were all killed. Because of this experience, Jasmine developed her hatred toward the Japanese and her love for the Americans. Later, when she found a badly wounded American pilot near a remote village in Yunnan province where she was hiding from the war, she risked her life to save him. Along with her 2 cousins, Daisy and Birch, a whole village opened its arm to heal and to protect this American pilot who traveled halfway around the world to fight for them, for China. This American pilot, Danny Hardy, belonged to a group called the American Volunteer Group. This group was formed in the spring of 1941 under President Roosevelt's executive order. Since America wasn't at war with Japan yet, the US military pilots were secretly recruited to join this group. 100 pilots plus 200 supporting members traveled to China with fake passports and enlisted in the Chinese Air Force. They were young and adventurous, but they had no combat experience. They were not even trained to fly P-40, the plane they were going to use. So the Japanese thought very little of this small group of inexperienced American pilots. By then, Japan already fought China for many years, and they had very experienced pilots and a lot more advanced aircraft. But the American volunteer group had a great leader. General Chennault, a colonel at the time, was a retired army officer and a very experienced pilot. He had been in China since 1937, and he studied the way the Japanese fly and fight. And he taught the young man really well. By the way, I got a chance to talk to General Chennault's granddaughter on the phone. I thanked her in person. I really appreciate what he had done for us. So in turn, those young Americans taught those arrogant Japanese pilot a hard lesson. In little more than half a year, they destroyed 500,000 tons of Japanese supplies and 296 Japanese aircraft. This is the official number. Actually, the unofficial number doubled. So their victory gave hope to the Chinese, to the Americans, and to the other allies. This is P-40. As you can see, the plane is decorated with a shark face. And the decoration is for a psychological reason. As an island nation, the Japanese were supposed to be afraid of shark attack. But the Chinese people who saw the plane did not know much about sharks. They knew how powerful a tiger could be. There are sayings like 如虎添翼, directly translated into adding wings to a tiger, which means giving power to an already mighty powerful creature, man, or event. So they called the Chinese people, nicknamed those courageous American pilots, 飞虎, the flying tigers. Each flying tiger was issued a bloodshed. It's a piece of cloth sewed to the back of their jacket. In Chinese character, it reads, "This foreigner has come to China to help in the war effort. Soldiers and civilians, one and all, should rescue and protect him." This is exactly what the Chinese people did in my novel. They risked their lives to rescue and protect a wounded American pilot. When this flying tiger's wings were damaged, the Chinese people were the wings of this flying tiger. They healed his wounds and helped him to soar back into the sky. I won't go into the detail about how they rescued him. Here is a historical fact. A wounded American pilot returned to the US. At a press conference, he named the village in order to thank the Chinese people for saving him. The Japanese spies in this country picked up the information and sent troops in China to retaliate. Everyone in the village, everyone was killed. This is what inspired me to write this book. Yeah, it happened in one of the darkest hours in Chinese history. Yes, it's violent. It has killing, murder, torture, rape. But it's not about violence. It's about love, sacrifice, kindness, and bravery. One review said it's a smashing historical account of China's chilling bloodbath during World War II. This is the very first review, and I cried when I saw the review. I actually cried many times during when I wrote the book because it's a tragic story. The characters became so real to me that I wondered what happened to them after the rescue, what kind of life turned out to be. And that's how I started writing the sequel, this time, it's because of my curiosity. But the curiosity did not kill a cat. It created a book. In Will of a Tiger, the sequel, once again, readers will meet the characters from the first book, especially Danny Hardy, the American pilot, and Birch Bai, the Chinese pilot who participated in his rescue. Birch is also Jasmine's cousin. The two of them became best friends, teammates, and sworn brothers. They vowed to live or die together. They promised to protect each other. And their wills were tested many times. In the summer of 1945, after taking many courageous missions together, Danny and Birch were captured and imprisoned in Yunnan province by the Japanese. What kind of life would they have in a Japanese camp? Many people, well, most people in this country know what happened during World War II in Europe. We know how cruel, how brutal the Nazis treated their enemies and their prisoners. What about Japanese? How did they treat their prisoners? Here, I will show you some research data. According to the US Congressional Research Service, the death rate of American POWs is 1% in German camps. Guess what percentage of American POWs died in Japanese camps?
Way over 50, like 60 or 70%.
It's a little less than that, but it's 40%. Compared to 1%, this is a huge difference, and that number alone tells a grim story. Many POWs died of starvation, slavery, torture, or disease. And this number is based on American POWs. Although the Japanese treated Americans terribly, they treated Chinese even worse. For example, during Nanking massacre, the Japanese killed all the disarmed Chinese soldiers they could find. They even went inside the international safety zone to search for those former soldiers to kill. And I wrote a scene in my first book according to this fact. And as the war got closer and closer to the end, Danny and Birch faced even more danger. On August 6, 1945, the US dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan. The day after, Danny and Birch were interrogated and tortured by the Japanese for the information about the nuclear weapon. This is also based on a historical fact. American pilot was captured and questioned by the Japanese. He did not know anything about the nuclear weapon, but under torture, he gave a false confession. He said there were 100 atomic bombs. And ironically, this fake number might play an important role in Japan's decision to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, ending the World War II. But several days before the end of the war, Danny and Birch faced another life and death situation. What did they do to save the other? And how could they do it when their lives were not in their control? And survival was just the beginning of a long, hard battle. especially for somebody like Birch. On top of physical disability, emotional pain, and survival's guilt, he had to deal with the dreadful situation, dreadful reality in China. Since 1927, the nationalists and the communists had fought for control of the country. The Japanese attack brought the two sides together to form a united front to counter the foreign invasion. Once their common enemy was defeated, they resumed fighting in order to gain control of the country. A year after the war against Japan ended, Civil War started in 1946, and it lasted for 3 years. Once again, the country was in chaos, and millions of people died during that period of time. By the end of 1949, the communists took over the mainland China, and the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, dividing the country into two unbridgeable parts. What would someone like Birch do? He and his father had worked for the nationalists for many years. If he stayed in mainland China, he ran into a high risk of being put in jail or even death. But if he left for Taiwan, he would leave his loved ones behind and also the land he had fought all his life. Many people faced the same dilemma, including my grandparents, and the decision they made decide the fate of their lives. On mainland China, soon after they took over, the communists started a campaign. It's designed to eliminate their former enemies, the nationalists. This is their policy. Lenient treatment to those who confess frankly. Severe punishment to those who remain stubborn. And when they say stubborn, they meant severe punishment, they meant death. This is a poster from that time period. As you can see from this poster, the communists really demonized the nationalists. Hundreds of thousands of people were executed during that campaign, including a very good friend of Danny and Birch. As the communists eradicated the nationalists on mainland China, the nationalist government in Taiwan was just as worried about a communist invasion. Martial law was issued in 1949, and it lasted for almost 4 decades. There was an inhumane policy. They would rather capture 100 innocent people than let one guilty person go free. And that number was quoted as high as 3,000. We can kill you, and killing you is as easy as crushing an ant. I wrote this in the book, but it was based on a historical figure. He actually said something along this line. Everyone was afraid, and no one was immune, even the ones who worked for the nationalist government. This time period is called White Terror. How could anybody live a meaningful life during those terrible situations, that terrible condition? Well, I hope you'll read my book and find out. From Chongqing to Yunnan, then from Taiwan to San Francisco, across the time and 2 continents, Danny and Birch remained brothers, no matter they were together or apart. Will of a Tiger is an epic journey of survival, hardship, friendship, brotherhood, and of course, love. A reviewer said it's a must read for those who believe good over evil, love over hate, and honor over disgrace. Both books are works of fiction, but to me, they're also personal. My mother and my grandmother had lived comfortably in Nanking before the Japanese invasion. They escaped the city days before the massacre happened. My mom was only 8 years old, and imagine an 8-year-old girl with her young mother surviving that massacre. Half of the population died during that period of time. It's just very hard to imagine that. And her family and my father's family ended up in Chongqing from Nanking. Chongqing, after the fall of Nanking, became the wartime capital, but at the same time, it became the target of Japanese terror campaign. For years, Japanese bombed this city regularly. I wrote a scene in my book about the bombing in Chongqing. This is a historical fact. On June 5th, 1941, thousands of people were trapped inside a barricaded tunnel, and they all suffocated to death, and including one of Jasmine's family members. My father was only 4 years old at the time. He told me many, many times about the experience of bombing. He told me the smell, the sight, the sound of bombing. He had nightmares for years. Once they lost everything except one small pre-packed suitcase. It was full of my grandma and my grandpa's manuscripts. They were both professors and writers. As a Chinese, I'm thankful to the Flying Tigers for their bravery and sacrifice. Without their help, the course of the Chinese history might have been changed, and my family may not have survived. And of course, I may not have existed in the first place, so I won't be standing here talking to you. And as a US citizen, I'm honored to write a book, or 2 books, about American heroes. It's a privilege, and also I think it's a duty too. So, you know why I wrote the book, but how did I do it? As you can tell, English isn't my first language. Before I answer this question, I will read a very short passage from my second book. It was raining. The wind blew through a shattered window, bringing in the frigid air. There was a narrow bed in the cell. Birch stretched his hand and instantly felt 1,000 pinpricks stabbing his arm. He had no way reaching the top of the bed. Shivering, he lay on the cold concrete floor. His eyes were dark and deep-set. His face was shriveled. A foul stench rose to his nostrils. He wasn't sure if it came from the room or from his clothes. An overwhelming sadness came over him. He had given everything to serve his country. His mother, sister, cousin, his brother and friends, his aunt and uncle, his girlfriend, his leg, and his ability to be a father. And finally, his freedom and his dignity. Birch lost the battle with his ironclad self-control. He was in hell. A famous Chinese phrase runs through his mind. To live in the worst adversity is better than to die under the most comfortable circumstance. The idiot who came up with that saying didn't know a damn thing about hardship. It would be better to die a hero in that trench, oblivious to the pain, the guilt, the injustice, the degradation. Starved and beyond exhaustion, his body trembled with pain, cold, and fatigue. His mind whirled. This is it. He had enough. He was ready to let go. Then he heard her voice. Young master, Xiao Mei called out. Be strong, you can do it. Life is hard, it can be very painful. You told that to Jasmine. Being alive can be harder than death, but you are a hero. Don't forget what Major Hardy said. A real tiger doesn't give up. You are a real tiger. When did she say that to me? In my coma? Images swam into focus. She squeezed his hand and shook his arm. Her eyes stared at him with concern and affection. She smelled of the jasmine flower on her blouse. Xiao Mei would be heartbroken. She didn't save me from the coma only to see me die here. Dad still needs me. The kids in the flying club were waiting for their Uncle Birch. He couldn't let them down. Xiao Mei, he reached for her, but she faded away. So he followed her into the merciful corners of unconsciousness. I was born and raised in a family of professors. My parents and my grandparents were all professors at Wuhan University. Even before I was born, they bought tons of books for me, but I didn't get a chance to read most of them. During Cultural Revolution, Red Guards, that crazy time period, Red Guards came to our home and took most of those books away. I read few leftovers again and again because not many books were available to us. For almost 10 years during the Cultural Revolution, all the university libraries were closed and bookstores had nothing except political stuff. So I was hungry like all the other kids in the country for books. But I was luckier than most of other kids. I had a great father. My hometown, Wuhan, is hot and humid in the summer. It's pretty much like here, but it's even hotter. It can reach 40 degrees Celsius, that's 104 degrees, with high humidity. We had no air conditioning, no electric fans. And during those hot summer evenings, we sat outside and surrounded by neighboring kids, and with a fan in his hand, my father told us lots of stories. From classic Chinese novels to Western novels. Day after day, month after month, year after year, he told us those stories from his memories. He didn't have those books either. I was so amazed later on. I asked him, how could you remember like everything? He said, no, I didn't remember everything. Why not? I said, you never said, let me think, and right, well, maybe it's this way. Maybe. He never did that. He just went through the whole thing without stop, and he said, oh, I just made it up. But it's because of him I fell in love with literature. But writing was a dangerous career in China at the time. My grandmother was the first Chinese woman to receive a master's degree in the UK, and later she became a famous writer and playwright. My aunt received her master's degree in Michigan, and she became a translator. She translated Peter Pan, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and other classics into Chinese. But both of them were wrongfully accused as counter-revolutionary rightist, which is equivalent as bad person or criminal. During Cultural Revolution, my aunt was sent to a labor camp for many years. My grandma was fired from her university job and ordered to sweep street at age 70. And later she was kicked out of her university housing and sent back to her hometown. She died there alone. So my parents did not want me to follow their footsteps. I had to choose something safer. I studied science. Although I wasn't passionate about science, as a good student and someone wanted to make her parents proud, I worked hard. By the time I graduated from Wuhan University, there was a prestigious program between China and United States in the biological field. 50 students from the entire country were allowed to enter this program. And after taking a series of tough exams, I became one of the lucky students. With very little knowledge of this country, very poor English, and 500 borrowed dollars, literally 5 $100 bill, I came to the US. 5.5 years later, I received a PhD in molecular biology. Later, I was trained as a post-doctoral fellow at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and I worked for UNC Chapel Hill for many years. While I was in China, I learned English as a foreign language in high school. The teaching was limited, but also I was a top student for almost all subjects except English for at least a short period of time. Why would anybody learn English when the country was totally isolated? It's useless, right? That's the reality, but also an excuse I told my parents for not studying hard. Deep down, I had a very different reason. It's because I was too shy to speak up. I did not want people to hear my voice. And you can't learn a language well without speaking up. When I came to the US, TV became my English teacher. I did not even have the concept of commercial. At the time, there were only 2 stations in China broadcasting from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. nonstop. And when the program changed suddenly in the middle, I was so confused. I thought accidentally I touched the remote control. It took me days to figure out. There was just no such thing as commercial. Although I published a number of scientific papers, fiction writing was still a faraway dream. I started writing not because I wanted to write a book, but because I needed help. I was very shy and fearful when I was young, and trapped in an unhappy marriage, I became more and more negative and to a point depressed. One day, I sat on the floor and folded myself into a ball, and in my mind, I watched myself hanging on a cliff. I was slipping inch by inch down that cliff. I cried for help, but nobody helped me. So I had to make a choice, either just to let myself fall or somehow find a way to save myself. And luckily, I made the decision to try my best. So I turned to books. We are lucky to have tons of self-help books everywhere. I read a lot of them. And one of the books made a huge impact of my life. It says if you write down 5 positive things a day, in 21 days, you'll be able to switch your mindset from negative to positive. It's too good to be true, too simple to be true, but I was so desperate, I was willing to give it a try. I started by writing words or simple phrases, but in time, words changed to sentences, sentences become paragraphs, and the paragraphs turned into pages. I did not change in 21 days. It took me 2 years. I think it's because I'm stubborn, so it's harder to change. But the end result is remarkable. I'm happy to say I'm no longer a negative person. And because of this practice, I started to open up. I became more active, adventurous. I learned to dance, to hike, even to learn to make friends. I learned to fly and got my private pilot license. I even went skydiving and traveled many places by myself. More importantly, because of writing every day for 2 years, I started to write short stories and then novels. And all those experiences I had, I think, made me a better writer. For one thing, I picked the flying tiger, this topic, is because of my own admiration for fighter pilot. I know how hard it is to fly. I just can't imagine anyone can fly and fight at the same time. It's just remarkable. I do admire them so much. It's still a very long, hard journey, full of frustration and self-doubt and disappointment, but it's filled with more joy and satisfaction and excitement. I really do love the process of fiction writing, the creative writing. I'm really happy I followed my heart, pursued my passion, and made my dream of being a published author come true. Last January, I received a contract from a publisher for both books at the same time. In June, the first one was published, and a little over a month ago, the second one was released. And both books received glowing reviews, and also it was featured in a dozen newspapers. And I was interviewed this Monday on WWII, The State of Things. I had a chance to talk to Frank Stasio face-to-face for an hour. It was an honor and just so exciting to let people know about my story. And the highest reward, I think, is still, it's why learned my story touched other people's heart. Many people told me they cried when they read the book, including a 11-year-old boy who read my book, and a 90-year-old lady, and there was a 85-year-old lady in our writers group. She read the book and she said, I just had to tell somebody, call someone. She called another writer in the group. 2 ladies talked about my book for an hour. Just knowing those kind of stories really made me think this is a topic we need to let people know. Not many people really know that part of history. I'm really surprised. I thought, because Flying Tiger helped China so much, it's very important to us, but it's also important to the people in this country as well. And when I told other people about the book I was writing, when I mentioned the name, they were like, oh, you wrote a fantasy book? They are the mystic creatures? I lived in an isolated country where we were not told the truth. We did not have the freedom to learn those amazing stories. Now I live in this great country. I have the freedom to learn the truth and also the privilege, the honor to write the stories about American heroes. I'm definitely going to try my best to keep the spirit of the Flying Tigers alive, and I hope you will all join me. And if you like my talk, there are 3 more talks in the next few days, next week or so, and this is my website. There are a lot more information about the book, my interview, reviews, and all kinds of other things. Well, thank you very much for hearing my story. Thank you.